Now we're going to switch to English and to testimonial by corporation involved, committed into entrepreneurship and innovation. And I have the pleasure to welcome Frank Mattes. He's associate partner at Innovation-3. I met with Frank because he created the Scale-Up Group. What is the Scale-Up Group? It's a group of European companies committed into entrepreneurship and disruptive innovation who focused on the specific phase of the scale-up stage. And Frank facilitates this group brilliantly. It's not always easy. And the group gave birth to the book Scaling Up Corporate Startup. Frank will share some secret of this approach with us with Stephen Cook. Stephen Cook is Chief Commercial Officer at BP Technology Group. And BP Technology Group is BP Central Innovation Features, who develop new business value for the group and works on long-term renewal for the company. Welcome to Stephen and Frank.
I'm in love with the shape of you. We push and pull like a magnet do. Although my heart is falling too.
So bonjour, good morning. Thanks for having us here. Actually, I'm CEO and founder of Innovation-3. This is a consulting agency that focuses on non-incremental innovation. And since we learned in the last 1 or 2 years that scaling up those great ideas is a challenge, we are focusing on this one. Steve, a couple of sentences on.
Yeah, bonjour, good morning. So I'm with BP, as Nicolas said, part of the central innovation team that we have. And what I wanted to talk to you about today, after Frank's talked a little bit about the theory of the work we've been doing in this scale-up group, I wanted to talk a little bit how at BP we're starting to put some of that into practice, really with the aim of growing new global energy businesses for the future that are more sustainable.
Okay. So let me take you for the first 10 minutes and another 5 minutes by Steve to what we have discovered. As Nicolas said, what you're about to see in theory and also in practice is not just some wild ideas, but approaches that have been validated by leading companies from various industries and the best insights you can find in this book. So the situation that we are facing pretty often is that companies do not lack ideas. That's really not the issue. You have intrapreneurship to unearth these ideas and design thinking and lean startup methodology to take it to a certain stage. Most companies call it MVP. The real problem is afterwards. The real problem is that these ventures die along their way, along their scaling up journey, or come out as a kind of minimized version what they originally were supposed to be. The problem is that the approaches that most companies are taking have proven their value in greenfield startups, but do not respect fully the context of the corporation. So greenfield startups theory, like design thinking, or like lean startup, or lean canvas, or lean scaling up, they perfectly fit to B2B or even B2C greenfield startups. But if you want to make them work in a corporate context, you have to look a little bit closer. What we mean with scaling up is an essential part of an end-to-end innovation process. At the end of the day, the purpose of innovation is to generate business impact, right? You want to recover the investments you made into innovation and also collect a premium in there. And if we look at it at a high level, you can say there are basically 3 phases. The first phase aiming at those famous blue oceans where you evaluate insights, where you ideate on how these insights could be turned into money, where you do the validation. These kind of work operating in the blue ocean is mostly done in innovation units. On the other end of the process, you do have business units operating in red oceans who do have procedures for taking a meaningful, sizable business to scale. So if you present them with an initial business of 5 or 10 million or so with a customer base, they do know how to take it from here. The problem is in the middle. The problem is taking validated concepts to a size where it can really be digested from big corporate. And it turns out scaling up in a corporate context faces 3 major challenges. First is it's a white space. It's not clear what the organizational home for these scale-up ventures is. There is no clear-cut methodology on how to approach. And most of all, it's not clear, there's no standard methodology out there as yet on how to orchestrate the collaboration between the scale-up and the big corporate. The second big issue is that corporate scale-ups do not have the same degree of freedom as greenfield startups, greenfield scale-ups. You may be aware of the famous story that, for instance, Twitter originally was a podcast directory before it pivoted, as the experts say, into becoming that short messaging service. Many of companies are using Slack. The company behind Slack was originally creating games. They didn't reach product market fit, but they found that the communication platform that they built to connect the US and the Canadian office, that was the real ringer, so to say, and now Slack is valued north of 6 billion. And the third big issue in here is how to work together, how to make it happen. If you recall that previous slide, in the blue space, in the innovation units, you do have an operating model which can be described as agile, which can be described as iterative and test and learn. On the other hand of the process, where you talk about the red oceans, the business units, they also have an operating model. This operating model is built on predictability, on processes, on 0 mistakes. But in this white space in between, you have to define a new operating model between venture and core to make it happen. So as Nicolas said in his introduction, we worked hard in this group of companies of finding a solution to the problem. And we found that the solution is basically built on 3 major pillars. The first pillar is validation. If you are working in a corporate context and think about scaling up in a corporate context, you really need to be sure that this thing that you want to scale up is really validated, because the space for pivoting, the space for changes is much, much smaller than for a greenfield startup. Why is this so? Corporate startups and corporate scale-ups are intended to be delivering a part of the corporate innovation agenda. So if you're off for your journey, you get your funding and you promised some milestones and you do not deliver because you didn't achieve product market fit, you're in problem. Second part is the process, and the third part is how to work together. Now, if we look at the first part, the validation framework, those of you with design thinking experience might be aware that design thinking speaks on 3 crucial dimensions. Customer need to want to have that product, right? There should be a willingness to pay, its desirability. It should make commercially sense what you're up to, the business model, the viability, and industrializing that product, that service should be feasible from that point. In the corporate context, we need to add one more dimension. We call it contextuality. That means that governance, that funding, the KPI system surrounding that scale-up venture. And we also learned that in many instances, corporates are scaling up too early. They are saying we have minimum viable product stage, now let's scale. The problem is, if you go back to the lean startup theory, an MVP is a learning tool. You really want to make sure that you're on your way to product market fit. As one guy said it, being first to market is not decisive. Being first to product market fit is. So MVP is not about engineering, it's about to learning, and the next stage is that you put out a minimum marketable product that the customers can use in their environment, and then you need to really validate that this entity is a minimum scalable venture, meaning the go-to-market, the value chain, everything else is there and is scalable as well. What you do in the process is basically you do 4 things in parallel. You industrialize the product, the service. You industrialize also the systems behind that, like quality management, etc. And you make your market. A typical trap that corporate scale-ups fall into is they do have their first customers, and the customers say, yes, it's interesting. But they overlook that the big bulk of what is in those Excel sheets, in the business plans, are majority customers. And it has been shown by that famous book, Crossing the Chasm, that mainstream customers buy completely different than pioneers or early adopters. So you need to change your go-to-market approach in order to win the majority. You need to obviously to grow the organization from a 2-5 people team to a team of say 20, 30, 50. And you also need to transition the management system, where at the beginning of the scaling up journey you talk about traction or net promoter scores or things like that. But at the end of the scaling up journey, you talk about a full-blown corporate management system. And around that process, you need to build around the organizational managerial aspects, like how to arrange the governance, the funding, which KPIs to be using at which stage, to handle with HR issues in recruiting, in seconding, and also on how to work together. And in working together, we found that there are 3 basic things to take care of. First of all, corporate, the business units and the scale-up venture naturally do not match. They have different operating models. And these manifest in 10, as we identified, areas of tension, which are in detail explained in that book. Second is, if you're a corporate scale-up and you want to work together with the corporate, like with corporate procurement functions, you inevitably fall into the Pareto long tail of activities of those corporate functions, right? They are set up to serve, so to say, the running business, the core organization. So there needs to be some alignment and some clear-cut rules on how to make it happen. And the third thing is, at the management level, it needs to be ensured that running the business on a day-to-day basis is taken care of with the same scrutiny and the same precision as building the new business for the future. So handing over to you, Steve.
Great, thanks, Frank. I wanted to talk maybe for 5 minutes about what at BP we're doing to put some of that thinking that Frank's described into practice. It's very new for us, so this is the start of a journey and not something that is complete. Peter Guza from Bosch is talking after us, and I think will give you a much more complete sense of what it takes to build something like this. But for us, 2 things happened in the middle of last year. One was the peer group that Frank's been leading had matured its thinking in the way in which Frank has just described. And secondly, BP refreshed its corporate strategy really to reflect the uncertainty in the future of energy, particularly around the impact of digital, Industry 4.0, the impact of concerns about climate change and the need for the world for continued increasing amounts of energy. And when you put all of that together, it becomes clear to us within BP that in order to be resilient through that energy transition, we need to be growing a number of new businesses for the organization in order to take us through that in good shape. And so when we thought about the minimum scalable venture concept that Frank just talked about, we realized that in our organization we have maybe 10, 15 minimum scalable ventures, or things which could quickly become minimum scalable ventures, but we had no capability to then scale those rapidly into global businesses that would actually release the full value from those ideas. And so we took that assertion to our executive team in September last year and said, we have a real gap here. If we want to deliver on our corporate strategy, we really have to get good at scaling some of these ideas into global businesses. And so that was the concept which we talked about, and we refined a version of that theory that Frank's just described into a proposal for BP, and we got the green light to go and build that in September last year. We said to our executives that we'd be able to stand it up sometime in the middle of this year. They said fantastic, but actually we want it by the end of last year. So we had about 3 months to stand up a minimum viable product of our scale-up organization, and we're calling it the Launchpad. And just to give you a quick idea, sorry, it's a very boring slide, but it just gives you a quick idea of what actually is in that concept for us. What we're talking about is what we call BP-controlled ventures. So these are ideas or concepts, minimum scalable ventures that BP either wholly owns or has a controlling stake in. And they have the potential to become global energy businesses, so things which can really operate at scale. And we're setting up a central team which looks a bit like what you might find in a venture capital fund. We have operating partners that have different kinds of expertise, expertise in growth hacking, expertise in business building, expertise in running private equity style playbooks, milestone-based funding, the ability to value these ventures as they progress, and the ability to do small-scale M&A type work to inorganically grow some of these ventures if that's what's required. But importantly, we also have an operating partner who is from the BP organization. The other two are hired externally. But we felt it was really important to have somebody who could connect this capability really well to the larger BP corporate organization while holding it somewhat separately, and really manage all those areas of tension that Frank just talked about, of which you can imagine there are many. We're setting up each of these new ventures as a separate entity with its own board. So these are employing entities in their own right. So people working in these ventures are part of a wholly owned BP subsidiary, but they leave the BP organization to join these ventures. And that gives us the ability to set up things like different compensation and reward packages, which are more what you'd expect in a venture capital or venture capital backed organization. So co-founders get equity in these ventures and are incentivized very strongly to grow them for the future. And importantly, we have to establish a whole different set of processes that work in a much leaner way than the processes which exist in BP. Like any corporate, most of what BP has is designed around managing risk in a large operating environment, and what we need here are processes that are lean enough to manage uncertainty rather than managing risk. And that's really where we've found the toughest problems. But we are working quite hard on it, and with the backing of our senior management, it's a lot easier to get there. I mean, this is just a little bit of process, but the idea is that this Launchpad operates for somewhere between 1 and 3 years, depending on the nature of the venture. You can read what's up there, but there's a balance of benefits here between startup-style processes, reward systems, funding processes, but also access to the corporate balance sheet, access to customers that businesses have in the corporation, access to the global scale of BP, the ability to deploy and learn quickly in our own assets. And then any number of possible outcomes are there at the end of that process. So some of these things will fail, and that's important to recognize. Some of these will be reintegrated back into BP as hopefully new business units in the organization. Some of them we will spin out, some of them we will sell or hopefully IPO, but those are some of the exit routes, if you like. And finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about about culture. A couple of people already have mentioned the importance of culture and culture eats strategy for breakfast and other such phrases, but it is incredibly important, and obviously culture is built from the team, so we spent a lot of time trying to get the team right, the right behaviors, the right characteristics of people that we bring into this organization, most of whom are not going to be from within BP actually. But it's important that we establish some principles. And for us, pace and speed is hugely important, and we need to emphasize that because we're coming out of a corporate culture where pace and speed are not the first thing on the list. Challenging each other and challenging ourselves is a hugely important part of the culture that we're adopting here. Adaptability, Frank mentioned the pivots that are necessary in some of the more successful startups that we've seen. The ability to pivot and adapt and flex is core to what we need to be able to do. A sense of ownership, it's really important as you come out of a corporate context or working on projects for other people that actually the culture is more about owning a business of your own and running it as your own business. And then finally, inclusivity and involvement is another huge piece of what we want to do here. So that's how we're laying out our culture. Like I said, that's a very quick run through the Launchpad concept that we're building in BP. It's very early days for us. We have one venture fully into the concept now, but as a sort of partial success story, at least we've moved that venture over the course of 3 or 4 months from a couple of pilots in our business to an entity that's now generating something in the order of $10 million per month of value for BP. So that's a good start. Thanks.
Hold. One more thing, please. Steve, Peter Guse, who will speak up in a second, and the other members from the peer group thought we might take this idea, this concept also to scale now, right? So what we set up, you see it in the headline, is preparing a community, the leanscaleup.org. So if you think you're interested in that subject, feel free to register there, and we keep you updated as we go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.